Boa tarde, pessoal. Quer dizer, boa noite, pessoal. Estamos começando aqui nosso terceiro encontro da CD, da Continuous Delivery Meetup, né, no Rio de Janeiro. Quer dizer, a gente chama de CD.RIO. E hoje nós vamos ter a honra, né, de receber a Tracy Ragan. A Tracy ela é embaixadora do DevOps Institute, do Instituto DevOps, e também ela é membro, né, da Continuous Delivery Foundation. Além disso, a Tracy é a CEO e cofundadora da Deploy Hub. Eu vou fazer o compartilhamento da apresentação dela aqui, que ela teve um trabalho enorme, traduziu tudo para português para nós, mas a apresentação vai ser em inglês, né? Então, eu gostaria de agradecer muito a todos que estão participando aqui conosco e que vão poder entrar também no decorrer da apresentação, e agradecer também a Tracy. Então, eu vou passar para ela enquanto eu vou fazendo o compartilhamento da tela. Tracy, thank you so much. This is our third event, our third meeting. We launched this meetup to be correlated with a CD Foundation idea. Our intention is be an official meetup from CD Foundation in near future, and we are proud to have you with us here, and the show is yours. I will start. You can start your introduction. I will, during this time, I will share your presentation and go to backstage, right? Thank you so much, Tracy.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I really want to let the audience know today is really a special day for me and for the CD Foundation, because we have added a new open source project, Ortelius, and Ortelius came from Deploy Hub.
Oh, yeah, and we are very happy about that, because we can see that your product, it's amazing, and at the same time you have the CD Foundation growing in amazing projects. It's really amazing. Thank you for this, and congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm going to backstage, right?
Okay. Well, next slide then. You can go ahead and progress it to the next. There you go. So yes, just a quick introduction to who I am. I am the co-founder of Deploy Hub. I was listed as the Tech Beacon, one of the top 100 DevOps visionaries by Tech Beacon. I used to be a member of the Eclipse Foundation. I was a founding member of the Eclipse Foundation, and now I'm a founding member of the Continuous Delivery Foundation. And as was already pointed out, I am part of the DevOps Institute. Next slide. So just a question, are you going to translate for me after each slide, or how should we do that? Okay. All right, so what are we going to learn today? Our takeaways are going to include this concept of continuous delivery and why it will become more essential as we progress into a modern architecture. We're going to really talk about how continuous delivery will change in a microservices repository kind of workflow experience. And we're going to talk about the importance now of configuration management, because configuration management is lost, literally lost, in the process of moving from monolithic to microservices. And we're going to talk about why. Next slide, please. So what's driving this new modern architecture? I think it's important for us to understand how big this market is and why we need to get ready for it. According to this analyst firm, Research and Markets, microservices have a worldwide market of about $1.9 billion. That's what they're expecting in 2020 to round out in, and probably continue through 2021 and probably grow beyond that. And the part of the reason is this thing about operational savings. When you move to a microservice platform, you really gain a lot of processing power for a very little amount of money. So accountants and CFOs like the idea of bringing more power to the data center at a fraction of the cost. And 86% of us now believe that microservice will be the default application architecture within the next 5 years, which is a pretty aggressive schedule, if you ask me. Next slide.
Tracy, I will fix a little issue in translation that I didn't see before. Just a minute. I will just to stay with the right term here. Just a minute.
No problem.
Oh, here. Oh my God. Here I will adjust because pipeline. Without pipeline, really, usually we use it here in Brazil, in Portuguese. We use this pipeline in English, same, because the translation is something that is used in oil and gas industry. It not make sense for us much for this concept. So because of this, I changed. I changed back for English, right?
Yes.
Let's again move forward for the next
please,
one.
Apollo, if you want to share these screens with anyone, please do. So if somebody wants to have these screens, I'm happy to have them passed off. So when we think about microservices, we really have to think in terms of what they are. And when we start understanding what they are, we begin to understand the problems that they cause. And the key to understanding microservices is to think functions. So microservices are basically loosely coupled services connected via APIs. And in a really solid microservice implementation, they're small functions. They're not monolithic functions. They're tiny, small functions. And they're immutable, meaning that once you deploy them out to your cluster until you deprecate them, they're always there. We don't copy over. We don't think about copying over like we take a jar file running on a cloud or a server environment and just copy over the new jar file. That's not how microservices work. So they're out there for a long time, which is the reason why we talk about versioning quite a bit, because we need to track what's running out there. And they could be, an old microservice could be consumed by an application for quite some time. So this idea of microservices and functions means that we're going to have a combination of these functions, and these functions together make up the application, and application versions and microservice versions have an impact. Next slide, please. So according to Chris Richardson, and I highly recommend anybody who wants to learn more to go out to that microsservices.io, because it's a great site for learning. But he states that a microservice should be implemented as a set of strongly related functions. So all the functions that need to work closely together should be deployed together and be changed together and packaged together. We're starting to hear this as something called component sets, or oftentimes application sets, even though that's very, very confusing. We at Deploy Hub and at Ortelius, we refer to those tightly packaged microservices as component sets. And each team that owns one or more service must be autonomous. So they should be able to deploy and move their microservices out to the environments, out to your clusters without really talking to anybody and never impact them. That's the hard part about microservices. Next slide, please. So microservices is what I like to call the last mile of Agile. We talked about Agile for quite some time. And even though we have Agile practices like Scrum, we still deployed and we compiled as a unit and deployed as a unit. We make a small change in our software, which made a massive monolithic change in the binary and in the release of that binary to our runtime environments. Microservices shouldn't be treated that way. And in fact, microservices should be treated where they have high frequency releases. I like to say microservices should be released all day long. We just got done when we were going through this translation of my slide deck, we talked about the term continuous delivery, and it had got translated to liberated delivery. I almost feel like that's a better description, because what we need to do is liberate the delivery of microservices as fast as possible all the way to production. And ultimately, that is the goal of microservices, and why we need to start thinking about how our continuous delivery model is going to change. And when microservices have made it all the way to a Dilbert cartoon, they're mainstream. And this, I think, cracks me up when I read it, because it's the pointy-eared boss says we're going to try something called agile programming, and he says that means no more planning and no more documentation, just starting writing code and complaining. And he says, I'm glad it has a name. And he says, well, that was your training. And that's kind of how we had treated agile, and we don't want to treat Kubernetes that way. We really have to be able to learn Kubernetes, understand its challenges, and understand how the delivery platform is going to change. Next slide, please. So continuous delivery is going to be pretty disrupted in a really big way, because microservices has a way of really disrupting what we do in continuous delivery. First of all, we take our application and we take a hammer to it, and it's like taking this wine glass, breaking it apart, and pointing to it and saying that's a wine glass. That is, in essence, what microservices is doing when you decompose your application. Some of the pieces of the continuous delivery process that's going to be disrupted that we have to start learning about. Number one, code branching and merging will be minimized. And we'll talk about that, because it's always a controversial statement when I say it. Second controversial statement, CI is no longer critical. In fact, it almost goes away. Continuous automation will be required. Companies who have not started down the road of creating workflows that push the product from development through production will be behind the curve. And continuous delivery will be required to achieve success in a microservice environment. It will be the heartbeat of managing microservices. Next slide, please. So let's talk about that first one. We have all learned so well how to use Git and how to manage branches and how to merge. But let's think about what a microservice looks like, and let's think about if that's real anymore. If you're talking about a piece of code that's Python that's maybe 300 lines long at most, not 3,000 lines long, I don't think we're going to see the kind of branching and merging strategies that we once used in monolithic. Now, there is a discussion happening right now. They compare it, people are starting to think of, well, should we do what we would call a monorepo, where we still manage our application in the same way as we do in Git, or do we break out every microservice and give them their own repo? For the most part, when I ask this question in live events, the majority of people raise their hand when I ask if they're using poly repos for microservices. I think that's the better road to go down, and there are reasons for both of them. But I can tell you in the monorepo, there's a lot more work in terms of creating tags and labels to try to track things. And branching. Branching is something that we have done in monolithic for quite a long time, but we can't think of the application anymore in a branch because we don't even have an application version, which brings us to our next concept. Next slide, please. So sorry, but I skipped ahead of myself. So mono versus poly repos. This is something that internally within your organization, you're going to start to have a conversation about. My general instinct, based on the conversations I've had with people, is that the poly repo will be better, but that means your workflow is going to have to change. And that's part of the reason why we try to stick with mono. But the more we hang on to old principles that are monolithic, the more difficult we're going to make a very distributed poly experience when we start decomposing our applications. So one of the first conversations you should start having with your team is, what should we do? Should we break out these repos for each microservice, or do we want to hang on to a monorepo? Next slide, please. So I kind of teased about the CI, and let's talk about what continuous integration was. Let's just review it as a point of discussion. Continuous integration, when we started doing that, had to do with compiling and linking binaries. We wanted a process where we could check code in, run immediately check it out, create a trigger, check that code out, run our compile process, try to get it down to a 10-minute build or less that did not break, so that we always had a release candidate. And we might have even ran some tests on that binary. It may not have gone to production, but we always compiled and linked it. That was the process of creating a monolithic executable. Next slide, please. But the reality in a microservice environment and your CD pipeline is builds are different. They really are. We're not using big pieces of code that's compiled. Python is the most popular language right now, and it's interpreted. You may use something like a Golang to create your microservice, but for the most part, the process of linking your code is not done at the compile step. It's not done as the very first step that we do in our CD pipeline, the CI step. It's the last step. We now link at runtime, which is a big shift. And if you can really wrap your head around what that shift means, you will begin to understand the complexities of microservices and the challenges that we have in the CD pipeline. So your build now will be focused on creating a container. And you may run something like a JFrog to scan your Python code for that particular container, and you'll create that container and you'll register that container. Once that container is registered, you can think about that as a releasable candidate, but it's only one small function. Next slide, please. So if you think about our monolithic practice, let's just go over it. And we all know this, but let's go over it as a point of discussion. In monolithic, we have a static application version. We compile it as a complete unit and we pass it across the pipeline, which means that production could be using version 5 of our application, testing could be using version 8, and development could be working on and compiling and working on version 10. That is a very common experience in a monolithic pipeline. Next slide, please. But with microservices, we're taking our static application and we're breaking it into small puzzle pieces. So we have to think now in terms of the link step and all of the work that we did around putting together our binary as new. We have to reimagine it completely. And we have to reimagine what our continuous delivery pipeline is going to look like in the future when we're managing many, many puzzle pieces moving across the pipeline at the same time. Next slide, please. So when we think about that, what's the impact, right? What does that really look like? So first of all, it's chaos. I almost want to call them chaos pipelines. And how do we bring order to that chaos? So for example, we're going to have microservices that are at dev or at prod, could be at test and prod, it could be at just at dev. They're going to be moving independently across the pipeline. When that happens, we lose this application concept, and it has been our North Star for a long time. And we lose the configuration management that kept us sort of tracking what we were releasing to our test and production environments. And instead now we have these loosely coupled functions that we're pushing across the pipeline without a clear understanding of what applications they consume. So the question can often be, what's the blast radius of a single microservice moving into a particular cluster? Next slide, please. So the reality of workflows here is that we have now multiple workflows for a single version of an application. So in this example, we show many microservices that are consumed by a single product, but they have their own workflow and they're going out to dev, test, and prod at their own pace. They have their own workflow and their own life cycle. So to manage many moving parts of these microservices, we're going to need to start understanding how these pieces fit together, how to potentially orchestrate them or not. And we have to understand the problem with workflows in general, and that is the number of them. We are going to move from having, let's say, I've spoken to companies who are proud to say that they have, several hundred workflows that manage a handful of applications. That several hundred workflows in a microservice environment is going to turn to thousands of workflows. And what we have to start thinking about are workflow templates, so that we don't have 1,000 workflows. We have things moving through the workflows, but they're templated. The other concept you're going to begin hearing about is event-driven continuous delivery, where you have an event catalog and you decide which events you want to run for a particular workflow, and you no longer have static workflows, just like you no longer have static applications. Next slide, please. So really, while CI becomes less critical, the continuous delivery pipeline and continuous deployments become more essential. We have to be able to meet the demand, and that's going to require some automation. And like I said in the last slide, we got to think of our workflow in a different way. We can't think of creating a static workflow for every microservice because there's just too many. If you think about the companies who have really pushed this technology, like Google, and Netflix, they have thousands of workflows, thousands of microservices. Next slide, please. So, like understanding the compile and link step in microservices doesn't really exist anymore, so we don't have that big binary. The second really important concept that you have to wrap your head around to start understanding how your CD pipeline is going to change is the fact that these microservices are independently deployed and you no longer have an application version or view. Because they're independently deployed and they have their own workflows, you really have separate pieces and parts moving across this new kind of pipeline. And that, in essence, is going to replace everything that you do today in monolithic. Next slide, please. I like to call these Death Stars. And that's really what they are. Netflix has somewhere like 5,000 microservices. Amazon, probably as many, if not more. That's a huge undertaking to manage. So configuration management becomes critical in microservices. And in my opinion, it's the key to a consistent and repeatable continuous deployment process if you understand the configuration of the microservices and the applications that consume them. Even though your application goes away, there's no reason that we can't start managing logical views of them and tracking which microservices, which versions of microservices go along with which versions of your application. There's some really fun kind of new terms that we're hearing. Haunted graveyards. A haunted graveyard is a pod of containers that nobody really knows who's using it, but they don't want to deprecate it because they're afraid somebody's going to come back to haunt you. Or a Frankenstein cluster, which is a cluster that continues to expand and grow, but we don't really know why. A lot of these problems are because of what I like to call microservice sprawl. And microservice sprawl is created because we don't necessarily know the services that are out there that can be reused, and we don't know the dependencies of these applications. So think about what we used to do in a compile process, defining the application version, understanding a bill of material report, understanding the difference between two application versions. Think about what your life is going to look like without that. And that's what we have to address in a modern CD pipeline. Next slide, please. Now, there's a reason why microservice sprawl happens, and some of that has to do with poor organization of microservices. Domain-driven design is a concept that we started talking about during object-oriented programming, and it remains as important today, and probably more so than it did in the object-oriented programming philosophies. In a domain structure, what you're doing is you're defining a microservice to belong to a particular problem space. I like to call them solution spaces, but most of the people who talk and teach about domain-driven design call them problem spaces. So, for example, if you have a collection of microservices that relate to security, or your purchase processing for your cart service, if you're an online store, you need to be able to organize those microservices so other developers can find them and use them. And that will help with maintaining your sprawl. And that becomes super critical when you start thinking about decomposing your application, because you will begin seeing your microservice architecture and patterns when you decompose your applications. You'll begin seeing common routines for database access, getting the customer address, getting a customer's account number. These too can be microservices that are reused. So the organization of microservices will be critical in your ability to control that sprawl that we talk about. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about some of the new tools that you're probably going to run into. Creating a container and actually delivering it to a cluster. The most popular tool today is Helm. Helm has been around for quite some time now. They have been part of the CNCF and have gained quite a bit of adoption. It's super easy to use, and it kind of replaces your CI process, because you use Helm to create your image, and to be quite honest, you can use Helm to update your cluster for a particular part of your cluster. Next slide, please. Ortelius, that's what we're announcing today. Ortelius is officially a part of the Continuous Delivery Foundation. And what Ortelius does is it sits in your CD pipeline to do automated configuration management and help you track the logical version of the application and the microservices that it consumes. This is basically replacing the compile and link step, your CI step created when it gave you your bill of material report, your application version, your diff reports, and sometimes your impact analysis reports. Next slide, please. Istio. If you haven't started learning about Istio, I highly recommend you start looking at it. Istio is service mesh routing, and it has the ability to really change the way we manage waterfall, dev, test, prod, clustered environments. So right now, what most organizations are doing in a Kubernetes world is we have lots of clusters. We may have several development clusters, we may have several testing clusters, and we might have several production clusters. But in reality, we potentially can start minimizing the number of clusters that we're using because Istio can do the routing. So remember that microservices are immutable, they never go away. So in essence, what we could potentially do is start integrating things like LDAP to understand a group, or let's call it a persona, a dev persona, or a test persona, or a production persona, and let Istio route to the correct versions of the applications based on the configuration management. So, in a future world, tools like Ortelius could take the configuration data of an application, knowing how it's configured, the versions of the microservices, pass that information to Istio, who could then say, these individuals get this version of the application without creating a new cluster. Which means then that a deployment would be Istio just rerouting from dev personas to test personas to production personas. Now, true, we may have some changes in database connections, but remember, we are starting to move into the potential of not just poly repos, but poly databases, meaning that every microservice has its own database. So you get rid of a monolithic database and you have small databases that have areas of functional data that it's storing. It will be a different experience in the future, and getting ready for it now is we have to consider these shifts, because Istio will be a big one in terms of how production is managed, and if we start leveraging it properly, we can potentially cut out a lot of problems that we've had every single time we have to move from one cluster to the next. And next slide, please. So this is your new DevOps pipeline. Let's just kind of walk through what that new DevOps pipeline is going to look like, because it starts the same and it has some similar characteristics, but there's a place in it that's different. So if we think about, we start with Jira. We get a change request. Developers fix it, get a code complete status, and they run Helm and create that new Docker container, and they register it. At that point, Ortelius will take over. It produces all of the configuration management details that we used to have in a compile and link environment. We provide the BOM report. We provide the difference report between how a new application. So let me back up for a minute. So what it's going to do, as soon as you get a new registered container, it's going to automatically increment that version of the microservice. And it's going to automatically increment all application versions that consume that microservice. So one change to a microservice may create 3 or 4 new application versions across the enterprise. So Ortelius sits in that spot to do exactly that. And it versions things based on the SHA or the git, the commit, and the change request, so that you have a very clear understanding of exactly what microservice is connected to, exactly what version of your application. It's going to pass that information off to an Istio or a Helm to actually do the deployment. And then things kind of are the same. But we do at this point, without rerouting within a single cluster using Istio, We're going to still deploy to dev and test environments, and we're going to redeploy again to production environments, and then we're going to come back around to our starting point. So what we're really doing is we're shifting the CI part of the continuous delivery model more than anything else. We're creating we're registering a container, and then we're kicking off some automated configuration management to figure out what now we have in terms of application version. Next slide, please. And thank you so much. And I do want to apologize for me not showing up last time. We had just changed our time. I don't know why the US does that, but we do that time change, and it kind of screwed me up. So I missed it, and I'm so happy that I was able to do this today for you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh my God, sorry.
It's okay.
Oh, Tracy was amazing. Thank you so much. It was amazing presentation. I'm very curious. It's the first time that I see a presentation that I put in the pipeline to present the Elm as a prominent member of this pipeline. So I'm very interested, because really it's the first time that I see. I know that we can use it, but it's the first time that I see a presentation promoting this. Great. The other point very interesting for me was that relation with Frankenstein.
Frankenstein clusters.
Yes, Frankenstein cluster. Let me come back. Frankenstein clusters was amazing. This idea about configuration management, because every time that I see DevOps or CD presentations, it's not usually people talk about this question, the configuration management and this pattern, Frankenstein clusters, for example. So it was amazing. Do you have any more anywhere that there is more details about configuration management that you can share with us, or any reference, or when you can read more, learn?
Out on the Deploy Hub blog site, I do have information about what it means. There's some white papers out there too. So go to the deployhub.com and you can download some. There's versioning, container information. There's stuff about configuration management. But I think the best thing for us to do is look at our past to understand our future. And there was a time that automated configuration management was pretty critical, and it still is in some platforms. And I hate to use a reference to something really old, but I'm going to. And if we think about the mainframe, and we have to go back and look at how the mainframe was managed, because a cluster is starting to look a lot like a mainframe again. We're centralizing again, and we're centralizing on objects and libraries. And even in mainframe tools like Endeavor, which really was one of the first continuous delivery tools on the market, it had a whole step of automated configuration management to track this stuff. And there was a time that we, in the networking world, when we were really pushing servers, that we had configuration management databases. I don't think that they were ever very successful because they weren't automated. You had to manually track it. We can't do that. We have to do this automated. It can't be something that's done where somebody's inputting information about a change in a configuration. And then we had a whole discussion around configuration management in the Puppet and Chef days. And we did that in a way that we're looking at products like this whole GitOps kind of new term. And GitOps is the idea is that you take a deployment file and you check it into Git and you deploy it from Git. That way you know nobody's touched it. It's hermetic. It's airtight. But in a microservice, and that's a really good place to start. the problem with it in what we have seen is that it needs to have more depth. We need to be able to say, if I update this single microservice, who's impacted? What is the blast radius of a microservice to any cluster? Because every cluster looks different. So there is a scaling issue with trying to manage things in a simple Git repository. But at the same time, it's a really, really good place to start. So if you're not doing anything else, do that. At least start there. But being able to create something relational and be able to understand how these microservices fit together, what their configurations are, all the way down to a cluster, and sitting above and looking across all clusters, is ultimately what we're going to need to use to really keep things ordered.
Oh, great, Tracy. About the Ortelos, I'm very interested about that. Ortelos project. I don't know if you can, but it's possible for you show one screen or something.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. I would totally be happy to. I don't have Ortelius running. I have Deploy Hub running. I'll only show you the open source pieces of it.
Excellent.
All right, let me share my screen. Let me get rid of this and let me go to your StreamYard and share my screen. Share screen.
A bar.
Okay, can you see that?
Oh, just a minute. Yes, I'm coming.
Okay, so I'm going to show you three aspects of Ortelius. That is the core of one of the open source core of Deploy Hub. That is important for the conversation we just had. And I'm going to start with domains. Domains are super critical for managing a lot of pieces and parts, and they have some real potential in terms of sharing microservices at a global level. But let's just think about it in terms of our fictitious store company we call the online store company. The online store company has 4 primary domains. 2 of them are what are called catalog domains, the store service and the purchase processing. This domain here is the hipster store, is the actual product, and it's associated to a dev, test, and prod environment. And this is what maps to the continuous delivery pipeline. It also has a testing domain, but we're not going to really cover the aspects of that. We're going to just focus on the hipster store and the catalog domains that it consumes. So if we think about how we see our world today, as we see them in application versions, and this is sort of what we're losing in a microservices world. They're there, they're just obscured because we don't track them the same. We don't compile them anymore. So if we think about how we get started, is we start in a very a way that's very similar to most developers in terms of packaging your application in terms of components. Now, components can be anything, but for the most part, in a microservice platform, most of the components are going to be microservices. Now, we can see over here, we have our online store company. We have a domain that's the hipster store. We have one that's purchase processing, store services, and that's stress testing. We're going to drive down into the purchase processing. And we're going to look at a single subdomain that has multiple microservices in it, and that is the cart service. The cart service has 2 versions of itself. One is the GC6 version, and that was what our baseline version, this says application base version up here, of the hipster store 4th of July sale. When we created this originally, and we originally defined the base version, we defined it using the GC6. Now, things change over time, and that's when things get a little crazy. Let's take a look at the components and how components change things. We're going to take a look at the new component, the GA7 version of it. Now, with the GA7 version of it, we know that this change to this microservice had a blast radius of 3 applications. Because we track everything, every time a new application package has been defined, we begin tracking the microservices that it consumes. And it's a back-end relational database with version control built on top of it to do that. Now, as I said in the presentation, we knew that we had a new release candidate because we knew that a new version of this microservice became available in a Quay registry. We pulled the digest, we pulled the tag, we pulled the git commit, and we also tracked the workflow that created it. And this was a Circle CI workflow 179. Now, remember, I told you at the point in time that we know we have a new release candidate for a new microservice, we also have now release candidates for all of the applications that are impacted. So let's take a look at what happened to our application. So if we take a look at what occurred here, we have a new version of our application. And if we take a look at what occurred, we can see that the difference between the original, the baseline version of the 4th of July sale and the new version that the microservice created is the cart service. And that changes based on the cluster, because you could have a cluster. If we go look at our BOM report up here, you could have a cluster that maybe doesn't have this new version of the shipping service on it yet. And when this gets pulled out, we may push 2 microservices out, because every single microservice is independently deployed and controlled. And we're tracking on the back end of it, we're tracking the changes at an application version level. So for every application, every logical new version of an application that gets updated, we are tracking it based on if it was deployed, where it was deployed to what clusters, and what it needs to use. And when we say what does it need to use, we do that incrementally. We don't just blast out everything that needs to be moved out, because we already know what's deployed and we don't need to redeploy it. So we're maintaining the purity of making sure that independently deployed microservices are pushed. But we also can say these 2 microservices have to go out in order to support that version of an application. And in essence, that's what we're doing. We're replacing our BOM report, we're replacing our diff report, and if we go back to our component, we are providing it back that impact analysis report, what oftentimes is referred to as the blast radius. And that was Ortelius.
Yeah, well, it was really amazing. This tracking, this support for tracking the impact tracking is amazing, really amazing. When you talk about much time ago, I worked with SOA, service-oriented architecture, and one of the most and governance. SOA governance was very important for adoption, right adoption, and efficient adoption of SOA. And then nowadays with microservices, we have microservices, services very thin and spreading many clusters and distributed in the cloud. Until now, I could not see something very good to get this governance. And Ortelius was amazing this aspect, because we can have the governance, the tracking about the impacts is so important. This visualization, very, very impressive.
It is. It's important to do the tracking, because we still need our North Star. We still need our BOM reports. We still need impact analysis. We still need the ability to say, if we go and deploy, this is the difference between this version of the application and this version of the application. If we go to deploy it, this is where the impact will potentially be. So what I'm hearing right now from a lot of SREs is they say they lack the confidence in doing deployments. And the confidence is because they have to wait for an incident report before they understand they have a problem. And then they have to go back and try to use tools that are tracking transactions to try to understand what changed. That shouldn't be the case. they should be able to easily go back and understand from a configuration management perspective. They need a diff report. Simple enough. They need to know what's different between the two. I didn't show you this. This is not part, I'll share the screen again. This is not part of Ortelius. This is part of Deploy Hub. But for example, we can take two versions of a deployed, and we can run a comparison report on it. And those comparison reports show some pretty critical information. So for this version of the application, depending on a particular cluster, we can show precisely what's different in that application. And in this case, we were tracking that cart service. Remember, we had the GC6 and it went to the GAF. So that's the level of tracking that we're talking about. And that's what's needed to have confidence to do deployments. We're not doing deployments better. What we're doing is providing the information. So when you use something like Helm or Spinnaker or Argo CD to push it out, you know what you're pushing out. And just before I leave here, we'll go to the CD Foundation. And look what showed up. Ortelius is out there. Yay! We're very happy. And the team, we had a beer and donuts party this morning and had so much fun. Everybody got together and patted each other on the back. There has been we have about 20 plus core contributors who have worked on this with us over the course of the last year. And we thank them all for the hard work that they've done. And we really do believe that this microservice management platform will help companies move to a microservice environment and still have the visibility they need into the logical application, so that all of their downstream tracking bugs and pushing tickets to an application version can still be done, because we're providing them that logical view of the application, even though it doesn't exist any longer in a cluster.
Amazing, really amazing. I will invite you again another day to present more detail about this, about Deploy Hub, about Ortelius, if you allow us and give us this opportunity.
I would love to come back. I'd like to come back too and talk more about, what I'm learning every day more and more about event-based continuous delivery. And the more we learn about that now and start wrapping our heads around it, the better off we'll be in a year's time.
Yeah, Ronald said that's good to send a message for us about this application, how Ortelius and Deploy Hub, you can get these critical reports about dependence. And it's amazing, really, because when you think about DevOps, one of the objectives is have control over on the medium time to repair. As you said, you should apply a tool that allow us tracking and control where is going bad, to really maintain control the medium time to repair. Without this, we can lose many time to find the point where it's going.
I know. Yeah. So we really we're talking about chaos, right? We're trying to add control back into chaos. It's a very chaotic environment, microservices, and what Ortelius's goal is to be able to, you know where the name came from?
Sorry?
Do you know where the name Ortelius came from?
No, I don't know.
So Abraham Ortelius is a very interesting person in history. In, I think, around 1570, he produced the first world atlas. Now, not only did he produce the first world atlas, in my opinion, he created the first open source community, because he didn't create that atlas on his own. He went and he worked with other cartographers, and he pulled all of their material together and assembled it into one single giant atlas. So by working with other map makers from all over the world, from China, from parts of Europe, they were able to assemble the very first map of the world. So I love the idea of Ortelius because he was he really was the first open source person. He understood the importance of community and solving a very difficult mapping problem. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We are solving a very difficult mapping problem, and we need the community to help us solve that. So that's why we named it Ortelius.
Amazing. I love history, and I learned a little bit more of history. Thank you so much. Amazing. And I will be will have attention about Ortelius. Sorry, my accent.
That's okay. I think Ortelius was actually Portuguese. I do. I think he was from Portugal, where, being the whole nautical experience and sailing was so incredibly important.
Yeah. So really, it's amazing project. Tracy, thank you so much for your time. We record this presentation, so we'll be available in our channels in YouTube, and everyone we can watch again and learn a lot with you. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank you.
That was amazing for us.
And thank you for having me on this very important day. It's been great to be able to do a webinar and talk about Ortelius on the day it was accepted into the foundation.
Yes, a special day, really a special day. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
You too. Stay safe and healthy.
Yes, thank you. And if I cannot talk with you again, I hope I can, but I wish you, your family, Merry Christmas, amazing New Year.
You as well, all of you. I look forward to a healthier, more positive experience in 2021.
Yeah, I hope so. God bless us, please.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Pessoal, eu agradeço muito quem pôde estar aqui conosco, quem vier assistir depois. Hoje foi uma sessão muito especial, por vários motivos. A gente vê que houve um lançamento aí do Ortelius na Fundação. É uma ferramenta que eu estou impressionado e vou acompanhar bastante. Quem sabe, poxa, é open source, quem sabe eu possa participar também em algum momento. Falo para todos que puderem participar, vai na CD Foundation, é uma fundação que está trazendo aí muita coisa bacana para a gente. Aqui tem o link dela, CD Foundation, e foi um prazer estar aqui com vocês mais uma vez. E se caso não tenhamos oportunidade de nos encontrar mais uma vez até o ano que vem, eu desejo, e todo mundo todos os amigos que fazem com que esse encontro aconteça, desejam o Cristiano Linux Man, do Papo Precisa de Mim, o Ronaldo Fernandes, que está aqui conosco, o Bruno Kaufmann, que também acompanha a gente aqui, fazendo esse trabalho, a Sheime Raman, o Leonardo Santos, todos eles um grupo muito forte que a gente tem trabalhado para trazer essas informações para todo mundo, para fomentar a comunidade. Eu agradeço muito a todos, que Deus abençoe a cada um, mesmo que não acredite em Deus, que as forças benéficas da natureza possam abençoar e proteger a cada um, que tenham, para quem acredita, um excelente Natal e um próspero Ano Novo. Fiquem com Deus e muito obrigado. Até a próxima.